The crisis of the abuse of children in the Catholic Church is a multi-layered crisis. It is a crisis that has unveiled corruption in terms of the abuses and of cover-up. It has unveiled political dimensions, legal and geopolitical, but it is essentially and first of all a theological crisis that has specific Christian and Catholic aspects to it. So here, what I want to share is just 10 points on the theological dimensions of the sex abuse crisis, especially in terms of the sexual abuse of children in the Catholic Church that has been unveiled in these last couple of decades, at least, and more specifically since 2017, 2018, which is, in my opinion, and of many, the beginning of a new phase in the history of the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And so point number one is that what is typical of these last few years in the Catholic reflection on the abuse crisis is a rediscovery of the theology of childhood and of children, of children's spirituality, and what is the theological dignity of children in Christianity and in the church, starting with the reflection of the famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, which lately has been rediscovered and updated and enriched by Australian theologian James McEvoy. And so there's a new reflection on how it was possible to ignore and forget that there is a specific call to become children again in Christianity and in the church. The second theological aspect is that the revelations and the debate on the sex abuse crisis have revealed that this scandal has become integral part of the battle of interpretations around the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, was the most important consequential event in the history of the Catholic Church in these last 4 centuries. And this scandal has unsettled and put into a crisis both narratives on the impact and consequence of the Second Vatican Council. So there is a traditionalist narrative on Vatican II, which is in crisis now because we know that abuses took place even before Vatican II. And so Vatican II was not the beginning of the corruption in the Catholic Church. But also the liberal, but progressive narrative on the Second Vatican Council has been put into question by the sex abuse crisis because we know that the abuses have continued and in some sense have increased in some context in the late 60s, 1970s, so after Vatican II. And so here, the contentious debate on the Second Vatican Council embraces many different theological issues, but the sex abuse crisis has made even more evident that there is the need of a new comprehensive understanding of what was the impact of the Second Vatican Council. A third theological aspect that has surfaced because of the sex abuse crisis is that the Catholic Church right now faces a very sharp turn from the century of the 20th century, which has been called also the century of ecclesiology, with the church at the center of the theological discussion, to a new era that can be called of ecclesiodicy. Is it possible to justify what the church has done? Is it possible to explain this gap between what the church claims to be and what it has done in some cases, in some contexts? This has given new relevance to the question of the possibility of the reform of the Catholic Church, or even on the desirability of the reform of the Catholic Church. In some sense, we now witness in the Catholic Church, in the theological discourse, the emergence of instincts of a post-ecclesial Catholicism. In some sense, we have shifted from the traditional way of understanding the role of the Catholic Church, or of the Church, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the Church there's no salvation, to something completely different, which is could be called in Latin extra ecclesiam sola salus. The only salvation is outside the Church. And so this is a huge challenge, not just culturally or institutionally, but also theologically, because one of the problems is that the Church has always limited the sinfulness to the members of the Church, and never to the institution itself. The sex abuse crisis makes much more difficult to keep the distinction. And so there's one question of the sustainability of the theology on the sinfulness that is only of the members and not of the institution. Fourth aspect is the liturgy. It's one of those aspects of the Second Vatican Council that has become contentious, especially in these last 15 years, more or less, and especially in the English-speaking context. The sex abuse crisis casts a light on some disturbing aspects of the connection between liturgy and the abuses, because we know that a number of abuses against children have taken place in liturgical places, in sacramental setting, especially confession historically since the Middle Ages, but it has really affected the understanding of many Catholics of what the sacraments are, especially the Eucharist, but liturgy in general. So that is one more aspect that has become really integral part of the cataclysmic impact of the abuse crisis on Catholic theology. Number 5, the sex abuse crisis is another chapter in the battle between Catholic doctrine, Catholic theology on sexuality and on gender and modern culture. It's clear that there is a Catholic specificity here, because for Catholicism, the place of sexual morality, of family, and of gender is evident. And so the sex abuse crisis really represents one more moment when the authority of the Catholic Church on sexual issues is questioned even more, and not anymore in terms of hypocrisy, but also in the terms of what is the causal connection between some traditional teachings of the Catholic Church on gender, on celibacy, on chastity, and the incidents of the abuse of children. We know that all these incidents take place not only in the church, but in the family, in other institutions, but Catholicism has exposed itself to this kind of attention, especially in this last century. And so the abuse crisis poses inevitable questions to the sustainability of the Catholic theology on sexuality. Number 6, the role of ordained ministry, or of the clergy in the Catholic Church. And so we know that the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church that takes place not just in churches and by members of the clergy, but also by lay ministry. And so it's far from clear that there is a proclivity of those who are ordained to be abusers more than those who are not ordained. But it's clear that symbolically and culturally, there has been the establishment of this link between the celibate priesthood and the abuse of children. And so that has become connected really with a recent discussion on the taboo of homosexuality among priests and religious. And so this is really one more piece into the puzzle of the Catholic Church that is trying to understand what is the future of the celibate clergy and what model of ordained ministry and of priesthood there can be in the future of the Catholic Church in light of the new sensibility on these crimes in the Catholic Church. Number 7, the recent theological crisis in the Catholic Church on the abuse crisis is inseparable from the so-called Me Too movement, which is a movement that originated in secular culture in the media, but that has taken roots within Catholicism. It itself is the issue of the role of women in the church and of their access to positions of authority. It's an inevitable question that in the Catholic Church for a long time has been addressed in terms of complementarity or of given symbolical access to some women in some very limited positions. The second abuse crisis has posed the question that is, would it be possible to have abusive members of the church if we had women in those rooms where decisions were made on personnel, on procedures? And so this is not just an administrative question, but it's really about the theology of power and of the role of women in the Catholic Church. Number 8, the very complex relationship in Catholicism between institution and charisma. So here, for especially in this last century, Catholics had become used to the idea that the institutional church was bad, was corrupt, was dangerous, but the charismatic movements were the future of the church, where there was more freedom, more authenticity. What we know in these last few years from revelations of abuses in these new charismatic communities tell us another story, that not only the institutional church, the parishes or dioceses can be dangerous, but also these new movements. And so the question is what to do in this situation where it is evident that the charismatic element is not necessarily and not automatically safer or a step forward in the church, in its progress towards more accountable, more transparent, more responsible church. Number 9, there's the whole issue of the role of the new media and of social media in endangering or changing the role of authority in the Catholic Church. And so the second abuse crisis has made necessary a new role for so-called watchdogs in the Catholic Church that on the one side have made possible the revelations and allegations of abuses, but in other cases have really created an ecosystem of information in the Catholic Church that often verges towards the conspiracy theories and the anti-establishment in the sense of the conspiracy theories. And so this is not just an information problem, but it's also a theological problem who can be trusted in the Catholic Church in terms of authority. Number 10, finally, all this tells us, or tells me, in my opinion, that the Catholic Church has not just a legal crisis or an institutional crisis, there's also a theological crisis. And so what is emerging is the necessity to go beyond a purely criminological approach to this crisis, which is more evident in English-speaking countries where there's a culture of transparency or accountability and of individual rights. And so this has to happen. I mean, a more serious approach to this phenomenon as crimes, as criminal, but there's also a theological, cultural approach that is necessary. And I think that what we have seen in these last 4 years, especially after 2017, with the cases that have been studied in Australia first, and then the new wave in the United States and in Chile and in Germany, we see now a new phase in the theological reflection on that. And this is why I believe it's important to start thinking beyond the short-term cycle of news on delegations and on grand juries and so on, but there has to be a long-term sustained effort to tackle all these issues from a theological point of view that is relevant not just for Catholics or for the Catholic Church, but everywhere the Catholic Church is, which means everywhere in this world. Thank you very much.